All right, well, let's wrap this up, the last 15 minutes here, with some of these books that didn't make the cut. And really, what I want to get at is why they didn't. Why did these early church councils reject these books? And the reason is because there was not good evidence they were affirmed by the apostles. In fact, just the opposite. There was good evidence that they weren't affirmed by the apostles. And most of these false books that were floating around by the time you get to the 300s were Gnostic writings. Now, you might have heard of this term before. Gnosticism was kind of its own religion. It might have been kind of almost like the first Christian cult. So sometimes it'll be called as, or referred to as Christian Gnosticism. But it's so far removed from what we understand Christian beliefs to be that I'm not comfortable calling it Christian Gnosticism. It did include some Christian beliefs, just like a lot of cults do, but it combined some Christian ideas with a lot of Platonic ideas and really developed its own belief system. You can see how radically different it is from Christianity just in this brief synopsis here. It was a religion that really built some steam, took a lot of people with it. In the 2nd century, one of its key beliefs is that Yahweh in the Old Testament is not the ultimate being. Yahweh is a God, but not the God. There was a different God beyond Yahweh, greater than Yahweh, and you can only know about that God, the real true God beyond Yahweh, through some sort of secret hidden knowledge. Hence the term Gnosticism, hidden knowledge. So they didn't deny a Yahweh or Yahweh being a God, but just thought that there was a greater God beyond Yahweh. So some of the works that came out of Gnosticism would be the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas. And you can see early church leaders that were aware of some of these writings. So they discuss them. So the early church leaders, even the councils in the 300s, they make lists of these false books to warn churches that, hey, these are books floating around that claim to be affirmed by the apostles, but they really weren't. They're false books. They're pseudepigrapha. And so the early church leaders were very aware of these books and knew that they were false. Now, sometimes people will claim that these false books are good historical sources. So sometimes you'll see things, or like the Dan Brown novels, the Da Vinci Code and stuff. They'll make a big deal about some of these books and how, oh, this is and it's all, a lot of it is sensationalism, right? To get your attention at the supermarket when you see tabloids or magazines and new books discovered or new information about Jesus just discovered. It's usually referring to some of these Gnostic works from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. But good scholarship will understand that this stuff does not go back to Jesus himself. This stuff was not affirmed by the apostles. Even Ehrman discusses this. So look at what Ehrman has to say about all of these false Gnostic books. Ehrman wrote, "There are, of course, lots of other gospels, in fact, some 40 or so, that were written down to the Middle Ages that are not found in the New Testament. These include narratives of Jesus as a newborn, as a young child, where he uses his miraculous powers, sometimes for mischief, sometimes for good, narratives of his public ministry, narratives of his death and resurrection. But almost all of these accounts, of course, are highly legendary, and with the passing of time, they become less and less valuable as independent historical resources." Ehrman also wrote, "We have nothing to suggest that the beliefs embraced by later Gnostic Christians were present in 1st century rural Palestine. And so these Gnostic sayings of Jesus found in such Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Mary, almost certainly do not go back to Jesus himself, but were placed on his lips by his later Gnostic followers." So again, these are folks who understand the thinking of the church. They understand that Christians are only going to believe things, only to accept things, if they're affirmed by the apostles. That's why they lie and claim that their works really are from the apostles, because that's the only way people are going to pay attention to them. But as I keep saying, the early church were aware of these false books and made lists of them, so a lot of them we know from the early church leaders as they made their list of these false books. So let's look at some of them. The Gospel of Thomas is probably one of the most well-known. There was a lot of excitement about this when a complete version of it was discovered in 1945. So this copy that was discovered dates back to the 300s. And what the Gospel of Thomas is, it's not a narrative like we would understand a gospel to be, right? Our four gospels are kind of a narrative of what Jesus did and said. This is just a short, brief collection of 114 supposed sayings of Jesus, many of which can be found in the four canonical gospels. Okay, so there's only a third of these 114 sayings that are unique. But these unique ones are very clearly from this Gnostic religion developed in the 2nd century. Early church leaders, those who did the research, as we've discussed, Origen and Eusebius, they knew about this false work and they put it in their lists of forgeries. And modern scholars who have come along and done similar research agree that it was not, in fact, written by the Apostle Thomas. Now, it's fairly early. Ehrman even dates it to early 2nd century, 110, 120, but even that is too late to have been affirmed by the apostles because the apostles would have died out by that time. All right, another common one that you'll hear discussed is the Gospel of Peter. We also have records from early church leaders saying that they knew of this work even before we discovered in the modern timeline, even before we discovered a copy of it, we were aware of it from the lists of these early church leaders when they made their list of things they knew were forgeries. But then we did discover a copy of it in 1886. Fragments of a copy of it were found in the late 1800s in Egypt. And this copy was dated to the 8th century. So modern scholars have looked at this. They agree that it wasn't written by the Apostle Peter. Scholars think it was probably written sometime in the 2nd century, but the earliest copy we have is from the 8th century, and that's just fragmentary that we have. But again, we know from early church leaders and their research that this was another fake. The Gospel of Judas is another common one you'll hear about in the news sometimes. We've got a specific note from Irenaeus, early church leader, who wrote in AD 180 that this was, in fact, a fake. And modern scholars agree that it was not written by Judas, but comes from that Gnostic belief system. So this is very interesting, though, and this is what conspiracy theories love, right? I mean, just conspiracy theories just seem to have no end. But the Gospel of Judas claims to be not about Jesus's public teaching, but his private teaching. And this is what Gnosticism was all about, that secret knowledge. So it's not like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which for the most part talk about Jesus's public ministry and what he said in his sermons and when he did his ministry. There are sometimes we'll see in the four canonical Gospels where he's talking just to an individual apostle or maybe the apostles as a group. But for the most part, our canonical Gospels lay out his public ministry. But the Gospel of Judas claims to be this private, secret information that only Judas has. And so the idea here that comes out of Judas was that all the other disciples actually betrayed Jesus, and Judas was the only true, faithful disciple. So it has all these supposed private conversations between Jesus and Judas. But just think about that from a historical perspective, right? I mean, already there should be some red flags going up because you can't, by definition, you can't have multiple independent sources for this because it only comes from these one person who supposedly had these private conversations with Jesus. So already, just from a historical perspective, we've got red flags. But then clearly, what's being promoted through these supposed secret teachings from Jesus is Gnostic beliefs They're clearly pushing a Gnostic agenda. Now, there's only one surviving copy of the Gospel of Judas that was discovered in the 1900s, and it's dated to either the 200s or the 300s, but it was bought and sold on the private market so often that it's almost completely fallen apart at this point. So just compare that one copy from the ancient world versus all the thousands of copies that we have of the other New Testament books, just from a historical perspective. Now, the last thing I'll say is just about these conspiracy theories, because we haven't seen the end of them, right? Every Easter, every Christmas, to sell magazines, to sell more articles, right? To get you to buy things, get you to pique your interest. This sensationalism works in the media to get people's attention. And I sympathize with it, right? I mean, in a sense, if you just come along and say, yes, there's new historical research that confirms everything that we believe, that's kind of boring. But if you can say, wow, there's new historical research that changes everything, right? That's going to get your attention. That's going to cause people to buy your magazine. And so a lot of these things are just built on sensationalism, but you don't want to get your education from TV specials. You don't want to get your education from these magazines. You want to look at the hardcore scholarship, and the book I sent around is a good place to start with that. Look at both sides, look at people in the scholarly realm, making their arguments. Look at those, not this sort of sensational stuff. Because again, people are just so sucked into conspiracy theories. And whenever I get drawn into those sort of conversations, it doesn't happen as much now as it used to, but you'll get dragged into these conspiracy conversations and it all becomes about possibilities, right? People will say, well, isn't it possible that so-and-so and so, isn't it possible that these councils had some sort of a political agenda and they were trying to protect male leadership, and so they pushed down any of these other writings that seemed to elevate women because they wanted to protect their male leadership authority in the church. And I'm like, yes, of course that's possible, but we're not dealing with possibilities, right? Anything is possible, but is there any good historical evidence for that? Do you have any sort of source documentation where they're saying these things, where they're writing out these explanations? Or do we have the opposite? Do we have good, solid documentation from these councils where they're explaining their process? They're explaining why they've landed on these particular books and not other books. Let's, look and see what they actually wrote instead of trying to, dream up some ulterior motives. But that's just how conspiracy theories work, right? So you just have to keep a straight face, keep calm, and keep a loving, respectful, winsome approach as you discuss with people and point them to all the solid, good historical evidence for our faith.